Could the USSR have defeated Nazi Germany without the US and UK? A common argument to back this claim is that 80% of the Wehrmacht soldiers who died did so on the Eastern Front, and Lend-Lease only account for 5% of the monetary cost of the Soviet war effort. So, on paper, it seems the Red Army could have won on its own. However, one doesn't fight a war on a piece of paper, you do so on the battlefield. To illustrate the shortcoming of these statistics, let's take an analog. We'll look at the unit cost of an Abrams tank. The total price is $4.3 million, and the engine costs $880,000, about 20% of the total cost of the tank. However, if you take the engine out of the tank, it won't be 80% as effective as it was before. It'll be borderline useless. You see, the raw stats about Wehrmacht losses and how much the Soviet war effort was from Lend-Lease would be telling if the Red Army won by attriting the Wehrmacht. But contrary to popular belief, this wasn't the case. The Red Army didn't triumph because quantity prevailed over quality. They won because deep battle prevailed over blitzkrieg. The Red Army was victorious because they defeated the Wehrmacht at the tactical and operational level. Now, it's true that in terms of equipment, the Soviets took more of a quantitative approach, but that's not why they won. With any kind of combined arms doctrine, be it blitzkrieg, deep battle, shock and awe, etc., one cannot gauge the effectiveness by looking at each aspect individually. You have to look at how they work together, kind of like how all the parts of a tank have to work together to be functional. The sum is greater than its parts, and if you take out one component, the overall effectiveness of the system will decrease by a larger percentage than the monetary cost of the part removed. With that in mind, when people say that Lend-Lease was only 5% of the cost of the Soviet war effort, what was that 5%? Well, a large part of it was logistical support in the form of trucks. You may have heard the saying, tactics win battles, logistics win wars. But what most people get wrong is they conflate logistics with attrition. Attrition is how much stuff you have, while logistics is getting what you have to where it needs to go. The German doctrine of blitzkrieg focused mainly on encircling and eliminating enemy units, while the Soviet doctrine of deep battle put a larger emphasis on hitting their enemy forces further into their rear and wreaking havoc on their supply lines. But in order to sustain these deep advances, you need a lot of logistical support to keep up with the tanks and infantry. After the Wehrmacht was defeated at Kursk, Field Marshal von Manstein basically ordered the eastern half of Ukraine to be razed to the ground in one of the most brutal scorched earth campaigns in history. This was done to deny the advancing Red Army the resources they needed to sustain themselves, and here, Lend-Lease trucks played a key role in keeping the frontline troops supplied. The ability to keep advancing troops properly equipped also meant they didn't have to pause to resupply as often, which denied the Wehrmacht chances to make new defensive positions. The Red Army would have to take far more losses if they were to storm such positions. Another resource made available to the Red Army via Lend-Lease was food. Early on in the war, German forces captured and plundered Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. This led to dire food shortages throughout the country. The NHS recommends that an adult male consume 2,500 calories a day, but U.S. Army regulations recommend that soldiers in a combat setting consume 4,500 calories per day. During the Battle of Stalingrad, the food situation was so bad that General Chuikov bragged that his soldiers were fighting on 1,000 calories per day. And no, I don't mean that he was bragging about how he only needed to feed his army 1,000 calories and they keep fighting. He was bragging that he was able to keep his troops supplied with that many calories. Also, a key part of deep battle is amassing troops at the point where you hope to make a breakthrough. When you're doing this, living off the land becomes inviable, and food imports become more important to sustain the war effort. The third asset made available to the Red Army by Lend-Lease was high-quality communication equipment. In order to effectively utilize combined arms warfare, the different branches have to be able to coordinate with one another. So, while Lend-Lease may have, monetarily speaking, represented only 5% of the Soviet war effort, if you took it out of the equation, the remaining 95% wouldn't have fought as well as it did. You could have all the tanks in the world, but they won't do you any good if you can't get their fuel to the front. You could have the best combined arms doctrine in the world, but it won't matter if the various branches in the military can't coordinate with each other, And your troops could have all the morale in the world, but it won't matter if they aren't fed. And this isn't just theorizing. After the Red Army drove the Wehrmacht back from Moscow, they lost a vast counteroffensive. However, this fizzled out by the start of the summer of 1942. It did so because the losses the Red Army took were unsustainable. They didn't have the means to effectively implement deep battle. But could the Red Army have won the war without Lend-Lease? Well, it depends on what you mean by win. In my opinion, they would have been able to push to the German border, but I don't think they would have been able to make the Nazi regime fully capitulate. Instead, both sides would have to stop fighting as their manpower pools became exhausted. Although, seeing how badly the Russian army performed in Ukraine without proper logistics and communication equipment made me question that they could have gotten that far, but I still think the Red Army would have been able to drive the Nazis from Soviet territory. But how would the Soviet Union have fared if Britain sued for peace prior to Operation Barbarossa? Well, after Germany invaded the USSR, they defeated the Red Army near the border, but then it reformed itself. The Wehrmacht would advance again, destroy the newly reformed Red Army, but this time the new Red Army learned from what happened before, so it's now more costly for the Wehrmacht to defeat. But they do, advance again, and the Red Army rebuilds itself again. This time, it's even harder to overcome, and this process repeats until the Wehrmacht is defeated at Moscow, shattering its aura of invincibility. But why was the Red Army able to rebuild itself, while the militaries of France and Poland could not? A common argument you'll hear is that it's because the USSR had an unlimited manpower pool. Well, if this was the case, the percent of the overall population of the USSR lost during the Blitzkrieg would be similar to France and Poland. But alas, it was much higher, with 70% of Soviet men born in 1923 being dead by the end of the war. It wasn't the Soviet Union's huge population, but rather its vast distances. In France and Poland, the German logistics could sustain a continuous push across the whole country, so there would be no unoccupied population for the High Command to rebuild its army from. In the USSR, the Wehrmacht would advance and then stall when it literally ran out of gas, and then have to shore up its logistics for the next push. These pauses are what gave the Red Army time to reform itself. But why did the Wehrmacht keep running out of gas? It was largely because the Royal Navy blockaded oil shipments from countries like Venezuela into Germany, resulting in an acute deficit. Had Britain capitulated, the Wehrmacht wouldn't have had this handicap, and the Red Army wouldn't have had the chances to rebuild itself and learn how to counter Blitzkrieg. I mean, sure, the USSR is very vast, and I don't think the Wehrmacht could take it in a single push, but it could take most of the major population centers, so the Red Army couldn't fully rebuild itself and then launch a second assault to the Urals to eliminate the capacity of what remained of the Soviet Union to fight. So, would the Nazis have done better if they had knocked Britain out of the fight? Well, how would they do this? You could argue that they should have built up the Kriegsmarine until it could challenge the Royal Navy. But the problem with this scenario is that the Kriegsmarine couldn't challenge the Royal Navy until 1945. And due to the aforementioned oil deficit, by that time, they wouldn't have had any fuel to drive it. And this is why Hitler's decision to invade the USSR when he did actually makes sense. He was aiming to get the oil in the Caucasus, and, had he waited any longer, the fuel deficit would slowly drain the capacity of Germany to fight. 1941 was his quote-unquote last chance. Now, to address the age-old question, could Germany have done something different to win the war? The only thing I could think of is to have the main thrust of Operation Barbarossa go south. That way, they could get close to Stalingrad in the winter of 1941, but would probably get thrown back by a Soviet counterattack to the Don Bend. But this way, when they launched this timeline's version of Fall Blau, their base of operations would be closer to the Caucasus, so they could take Baku in the winter of 1942-43. Now, I'm not saying that Germany would have won if they did this. I'm saying it would have had a better chance if they took this approach. Now to address two other what-if scenarios I find disingenuous. First being that they should have just focused on Moscow to win the war. In operational planning for Barbarossa, Army Group Center was tasked with taking Moscow. After the Battle of Smolensk, the commander of Army Group Center, Fedor von Bock, wanted to advance on Moscow. However, Hitler ordered him to link up with Manstein's Army Group South, east of Kiev, to encircle the Red Army garrison there. After that, Army Group Center advanced on Moscow and were subsequently routed by the Red Army reinforcements from Siberia. If they advanced on Moscow right after Smolensk, they may very well have taken the city, but it would also mean that they wouldn't have encircled the Red Army units defending Kiev. So, instead of being driven back by the reinforcements from Siberia, the Siberian troops could have hit Army Group Center from their northern flanks, while the Red Army forces in Kiev could do so from the south, potentially encircling them. So, I would actually argue that had the Wehrmacht advanced on Moscow right after Smolensk, they would have been defeated even sooner than they actually were. The other what-if scenario that people cling to is that Germany and Japan should have invaded the USSR together, forcing it to fight a war on two fronts. The main piece of evidence used to support this argument is that the reinforcements which drove the Wehrmacht back at the Battle of Moscow came in from Siberia, and they would have been tied up fighting the Japanese. The main problem with this argument comes down to logistics. If Stalin was going to choose between defending Siberia or the European part of the USSR, where the majority of population and industry resided, he'll choose the European part. Now, you could argue that if he didn't protect Siberia, then the Japanese could advance to the Urals, but if you think crossing hundreds of kilometers of rural farmland is logistically taxing, just imagine how difficult thousands of kilometers of rugged wilderness would be. I mean, sure, Japan could take the eastern third of Siberia, but by the time that they got to the Baikal region, their logistics would be so overstretched the Red Army would have to station, at most, a single division to defend Irkutsk. So no, this scenario doesn't work either. Now, if you want to learn more about the role that Soviet tactics played in the war, I would highly recommend that you watch the lecture, The Three Alibis by Jonathan House, and if you want to delve into it further, you can read When Titans Clashed, a book Jonathan co-authored with David Glantz, who was the first Western historian to read the Kremlin archives after the fall of the Soviet Union.